Welcome to the Dixiecryptid channel. This is Marathon 129, and I'm pretty full. I was just at a Mexican restaurant, and I had the biggest burrito I've ever had. It looked like a little Mexican baby wrapped up in a sleeping bag. And I couldn't even eat it all. I ate about half of it, but I brought the other half home, and I might eat it tonight. Let's get rolling with some stories. I got 5 of them in this one. The last one is great. They're all great, but the last one is real exciting, and I hope you guys enjoy it. All right, here we go. Here's an email from Rob, and this is it's a short, but it's a really good story. Here's what he writes. It had only been months since I'd lost my sister. I was depressed and feeling all alone when I reached out to a friend. He suggested I get out and go down around the Okmulgee, I think I pronounced that right, Okmulgee, maybe that's a river or a swamp, I'm not sure. And he wanted to scout for hogs. We'd planned on going on a hunt soon, so I decided he was right, that it might be good for me. I took my dog, a cocker spaniel named River, and we headed out. We'd worked our way down to the famous bass fishing lake through the woods for about a mile when I got a whiff of something that could have knocked a buzzard off a poop wagon. Oh, I love the way you guys write. I can't even describe it. It was just bad. I started looking around for it, thinking what I smelled was something dead. I thought coyotes might be a concern, but I had my pump-action Mossberg loaded with buckshot and slugs, so I wasn't too worried. About that time, River disappeared somewhere, and I started seeing water through the trees, so I knew I must be getting close to the lake. As I got closer to the water and rounded a little thicket, I immediately saw something standing to the left of me. I knew this is what I must have been smelling. Admittedly, I wasn't wearing my glasses, so I couldn't see every minor detail, but I knew what this thing was. I noticed his lips for some reason. He wasn't quite showing his teeth, but he wasn't not showing them either. It was more like a relaxing moment, kind of like after you brush your teeth. But what surprised me the most was when he saw my shotgun. It had been tucked behind my leg in such a way that it was hidden from the creature at first, but in my shock, I took a step back, dropping it into plain sight. He took one look at it and zeroed in on it with real fear and recognition on his face. He knew what this thing was, and I believe he knew that it could hurt him. His eyes darted back and forth between me and the shotgun, so I knew I had to do something. I raised my free hand in a show of peace to sort of say, hey, I'm not here to hurt you. That must have satisfied him because he turned and walked off. It was actually more like a glide than a walk. I exhaled and realized I'd been holding my breath. I admit I was shocked to my core. I know that they're there now. I went back out there with my friend during the rainy season and we found 2 sets of tracks. I've shared this story once before with Wes. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. I guess he means Wes, who's the Sasquatch Chronicles guy? Wes Gerber. Well, I'm not sure what he's talking about. But I thought this was a great story. I mean, he's not very pretentious. He's not assuming anything. He knows what he saw. He saw the thing look at his shotgun, and it appeared that this thing knew what the shotgun was, and then it just left. There was no aggression, no violence, no nothing. But this guy, Rob, Mr. Rob, had an experience of a lifetime. And what an awesome story, Rob. Thank you very much for sending it, buddy. We all enjoyed it. Here is an email from Brian. This is a good one. Brian, thanks for sending it. Here's what he writes. I'm glad I ran across your channel. I really like listening to the stories that you tell. I like that they're not too long and tedious. It keeps them interesting. I have a short story for you about a time when I had a run-in with a Bigfoot. I was out in the woods with a young lady in my full-size 79 Ford Bronco. Oh, man. I wonder if you still have that Bronco, Brian. I had a 78 Bronco. It was white. It was an OJ Bronco, and I loved that car. And I don't know why I sold it. But anyway, I'm glad we were in that vehicle, or we might have not gotten out of there. We were down in the woods doing what couples do in the woods at night when we heard a noise from something that was making sure we knew it was there. What exactly do you do in the woods? What do couples do in the woods? I'm not sure I know what you mean there, Brian. Anyway. Oh, I keep interrupting this story. I'm sorry. We never heard any hoops or hollers nor any tree knocks. It was just the god-awfulest breaking of limbs and trees I've ever heard in my life. It was loud and angry. It didn't just want us to know it was there. It wanted us to leave. I talked to a Bigfoot researcher who said it was mad because at one point I got out and urinated, thereby marking its territory as mine. Well, maybe that's so. The researcher also said that this Bigfoot was probably a loner, and that's why we never heard any grunts or tree knocks. He didn't have any friends around to communicate with. Whatever it was telling us, we stopped doing what we were doing and we decided to get the heck out of there. My lady friend was so scared she curled herself up in a ball in the front seat and hugged her legs with her head down. I was scared, but I had to keep control and drive us out. I was checking the mirror and what little I could see in the brake lights for anything coming up behind us. We worked our way around a corner holding our breaths, expecting at any time to see something jump out at us or show itself. Then we hit a straightaway and I kicked it from third into fourth. But up ahead was a tree lying across the road. It wasn't so big that we couldn't get over it in my Bronco, but a smaller or less powerful vehicle probably wouldn't have made it. I made the split-second decision not to stop. I knew there was no way I was getting out of that truck and moving that tree by hand. We were moving so fast when we hit it, I didn't feel like much more than a bump in the road. We were so scared, we didn't feel it anyway. We headed straight for my buddy's house who lives down in that area. He and I had done a lot of exploring on our four-wheelers over those woods. The Bigfoot researcher told me that the Bigfoot probably knew my buddy because it followed us to his house that night. After that, he had several strange occurrences happen. One night he heard all kinds of bumps and growls outside like someone was throwing things at the house. One thing I don't understand, it was pretty clear that it wanted us to get out of there. But why did it block the road with a tree? Was it trying to push us further in the woods? Or was it trying to hurt us? Or was it trying to catch us on the tree? If so, what did it want? This all happened off of Highway 221 in Forest City, North Carolina. If anyone has an answer for what it was trying to do, I'd sure like to know. Thank you, Cam, for letting me tell my story, and I hope you can make sense of it. Oh, man, I made perfect sense of it, Brian. That's a great story, and those are interesting. That's an interesting scenario. I mean, you see this thing or hear this thing in the woods. Do you think this thing actually pushed a tree over? I mean, backing up, you're assuming that this thing pushed the tree over. And I'm wondering, do you really think this thing pushed the tree over, or did it just fall over? Was it a green tree? Was it a rotten tree? Could it have been a coincidence? I don't know. I'm just asking questions I would ask you if we were sitting here together talking. But it's real interesting, and I'm pretty sure your girlfriend didn't want to go parking with you in the woods anymore after that. I bet she probably never went parking out in the woods ever again in her life, but maybe you still know the girl, I don't know. But anyway, it's a great story, and this is one of a few I've heard where people are parking and making out and having some enchanted moments, and a Bigfoot interrupts the enchanted moment. And it's got, for the guy, it's got to really piss you off. For the girl, it's probably going to scare him to death. But again, I'm just rambling, and I'm going to quit rambling. Brian's a great story. Thank you very much, and I really loved it. Thanks, buddy. This gentleman wants to keep his name silent. He wants to be anonymous, but here's what he writes. This is a story from my my neck of the woods, and I love these. Some time ago, I left a comment saying that I would write you about an experience I had sometime around 1997 in Memphis, Tennessee. You really must forgive me for not writing as soon as I said I would, but I started thinking about how unexciting and uncertain my experience was, and I became hesitant to share it. Nevertheless, what I'm about to write really happened. I warn you, it's not much of an experience, if it is one at all. As a matter of fact, I didn't know I was having an experience at the time, and I wouldn't know today, were it not for circumstances that later came to my understanding. I was born and raised in eastern Arkansas, my little town at the last hilly area of Crowley's Ridge, where it ended in the Delta Plain on the western banks of the Mississippi River. The closest town to ours in Mississippi was a place called Lula. I only mention this to you so that you know that I'm also a son of the South, and I grew up, like you, I think, in the Mississippi River Delta. Yes, sir, that's where I grew up. We're river rats, man. Later in life, after I was married, I lived in Memphis, Tennessee. My subdivision was called Oak Haven, which boasts many mature stands of isolated forests all over, hence the name Oak Haven. Sometime after my experience, I realized that these stands of forest and underbrush extended due south of my home to northwestern Mississippi without a break, except for a few well-traveled roads that could easily be crossed at night without anyone noticing. It's possible to travel as far as South Haven, Mississippi, within the tree line of the woods that I mentioned. My home was about 5 miles north of State Line Road, the border between Tennessee and Mississippi. I had a beautiful home that backed up to a large green park. 100 yards due east of my home was a little creek that drained into a 10-acre lake. One of the aforementioned mature stands of forest ran alongside the creek, intersected only by one lonely residential road. It bordered the part of the park that people did not frequent, maybe because of a regular tall grass that was ever present and the fear of snakes. The city kept this area cut, but only every couple of weeks, so the grass would often be too tall for such pleasantries as picnics and things like that. Over the years, I spent many an evening cooking out and having friends over, but one particular night, I believe it was 1997, I was home alone and standing out on my recently built freestanding deck. I was congratulating myself on the craftsmanship and choice of location. Placed on a partial slope, it was tucked into the pines and flanked by a couple of big maples, but still afforded a spectacular view of the river. It was just after dark in the late summer, with a huge full moon looming over the line of woods that grew along the creek. I was standing completely still, watching the moon and thinking how glorious this sight was, when out of the corner of my eye I caught movement. It looked like someone walking out in the field. I took note of the fact that he looked like a really tall basketball player with exceptionally wide shoulders, and that he was just casually walking along my neighbor's chain-link fence. He seemed to have a spring in his step that made him bounce along in a side-to-side motion. The fact that he appeared to be wearing all black gave the impression of him being no more than a silhouette in the moonlight. He had a tall, thin, powerful-looking physique, marred only slightly by a bit of a beer belly. His path took him right along my backyard fence where I stood watching, hidden from view through the low-hanging maple leaves. He must have sensed someone watching him because he suddenly stopped and stood completely motionless for 5 seconds or so before dropping straight down into the tall grass. I found this behavior alarming. So much so that I turned and quickly retreated across my yard to my back door. Once inside, I locked the doors before cautiously peering through the windows. I couldn't see anything out there now, but I was troubled by what I had seen for the rest of the night. A few days later, with that incident pushed completely out of my mind, I had another one of my little get-togethers. My wife worked second shift, so these were usually just guys hanging out and cooking steaks. That night was no exception. We had our meal and we were just hanging out when we decided that the citronella candles weren't doing their jobs and decided to go inside with our beers. As we sat around talking, something suddenly shook the whole house with a thunderous smack. I had vaulted ceilings and judged the impact to be at least 12 feet up. Furious that someone or something had hit my home, I went outside to check it out. Some of the others followed me out, but we could find no evidence of anything that could have hit the house. I thought maybe a goose had flown into it, but that didn't really make sense. We spent the rest of the evening passing theories around as to what it might have been. None of them seemed to hold water. It would be many years before I would learn that house slapping is a common behavior of a Bigfoot. I believe I saw a Bigfoot that night, and it upset him that I watched him while he was unaware. I think he slapped my house in retaliation. I also believe he was drawn there by the many cookouts. I know it doesn't sound like much, but it happened. I would prefer not to have my name used, but the people who live around there will know who I am through the description of my house. Not long after this happened, I relocated to Arizona for other reasons, still ignorant of what I had seen and experienced. It wasn't until I began reading and listening to shows like yours that I finally realized I had had an encounter. Thanks for reading my story. Oh, sir, that's a great story. You actually probably saw a Bigfoot walking through the field. And it's funny to me that y'all, I'm sorry, my big old lab is just walking around and around and around. He cannot settle. You know, about a month and a half ago, he was almost dead. I mean, he really was. I thought, there was one morning I thought I was going to have to take him to the vet and say goodbye to him. But he got up that day and I thought I'd give him another day, and we put him on some other medicine and he is going strong. I can't keep him down. He wants to move around all the time. Chunk, relax, buddy. Lay down. Anyway, I think this guy saw a Bigfoot, and what's strange to me is that Bigfoot has the reputation of wanting to stay hidden. Yet in some cases, these things just walk through fields and residential areas. I mean, it's the craziest thing I've ever heard of. And people that think or say that they can, we had one story in this set where a guy was talking to a researcher, and apparently the researcher knew exactly why the Bigfoot was doing anything. My opinion is, I don't think anybody has a clue. I don't think anybody has a clue why these things do what they do and what's on their mind and what their reactions are to our reactions. Nobody knows. I mean, it's always different. There is no single pattern that comes across in all these stories. They're all not vastly different, but they all have different behaviors that I don't see how anybody could come up with a standard answer for anything these things do. But that's just my opinion. What do I know? Nothing. I don't know nothing. But I'm just going by the evidence of these stories, and that's it. So sorry about the dog clicking around halfway through the story. Maybe y'all can get through it and not get too mad at me. But it was a great story, sir, straight from my hometown, and I pretty much know where he's talking about. Oak Haven. That was a beautiful area at one time. I don't think it is now. I think it's the hood now. But Memphis was a great place to grow up, and I love my summers there. I love my life there. It was a great little town, and thank you. It was great to get a story from my hometown. Really appreciate it. Here's an email from Brandon. This is a really good one. He says, let me start with a big thanks for what you're doing. You entertain and inform and educate people, all the while having a good old time. We're just going to skip all that. Thank you. Thank you, Brandon, for saying all that, and I appreciate that. I love doing this more than you enjoy listening, I promise you. So let's get to his story. I was about 15 years old and the youngest of 3. My older siblings had both moved out for their own reasons, but I thought that I could never leave. My father owns a small parcel of acreage surrounded by my late grandfather's land of about 25 acres, a mile outside of Hurricane, West Virginia. I have hunted my whole life in these woods and the adjacent properties. This land is full of caves, cliffs, and hillsides. so thick with bush in some places you can't shoot 100 yards even in the wintertime when the leaves are gone. It was and still is my home. I don't live there with my father anymore, but I still hunt and sometimes trap on the property. It's as much a part of me as my 2-year-old son. Late one night, we just got back to the house after helping my father's new girlfriend move. We got out of the car and stopped in our tracks, and we heard the most god-awful yelping and growling coming from a big hillside field that used to be a horse pasture on the opposite side of the house. I took off running around the house and got there before my dad. We had 3 little dogs at the time. One was a rat terrier, and the other 2 were Chihuahua mixes. Blinded by the mix of house lights and darkness, I almost tripped over a coyote trying to eat one of them. They were spinning in circles, jaws locked together and growling up a storm. Instinctively, I grabbed onto the leg of my dog and tugged him away from the coyote, and I tossed him a few feet behind me. At that moment, another coyote stormed through the brush to my right, and he plowed into the other coyote. They were both back on their feet in an instant and running up the old logging trail past an old barn built by my great-grandfather. From start to finish, the whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 10 seconds. Once the coyotes were gone, I realized the dog they'd grabbed was Rocky, the smallest of the 3. It ran quickly by my dad, who seemed to have walked around the house instead of running. I looked back up at the barn and saw something else. It was another set of eyes. They were 8 feet up a tree on the far hillside left of the barn. There was just enough light from my grandmother's house to illuminate one side of the tree. The eyes were huge and they were far apart. They shined with a different shade from the light on the trees from the house. The house light was more of a yellow light, while the eyes were a dark red color. I didn't think it could be eyes at first, and then it blinked. As soon as it blinked, it turned its head towards the light. It was still hidden in the shadows of the tree, but I never lost sight of those eyes. The head turned away, and then it turned back, never losing their glow. "Do you see that?" I asked my dad. He responded with, "Get inside now." I still wasn't sure he was seeing what I was seeing, so I asked him again, "Dad, did you see that?" He was holding open the door, and he said firmly, "Get inside now." I sat in my room with the lights on and the blinds closed the rest of the night. My room was on the side of the house that everything had just happened, but the window faced the wrong direction, so I couldn't look out in the field. My window was 7 feet off the ground, and I felt like a sitting duck. That thing I saw would have had to bend down to get in. Every minute of that night is burned into my mind. Waiting for the sunrise may have been the worst part. I'm 25 years old now, and I hunt hard every year. I go out before sunrise, and I stay out until my girl summons me home. I have also become an avid Bigfoot researcher. It's become somewhat of a religion more than a hobby. I do construction with my uncle and my brother. They're far from believing in anything of the sort, so I don't talk about it. I feel like telling you the story will help me relieve my need to tell my story. On a side story, my mother is a spiritual woman, a green witch for lack of a better term. She has many friends of various calibers. One day, she told me she had bought a gift for someone from an old friend of hers and that the woman was coming to deliver it. My mother said she had a story to tell us from back when they were teens. I'm not much of one to sit around and listen to my mother's friends' stories, but the lady arrived, and this is the story that she told. When she was 17, she and a handful of other kids went out on her family's farm way back in the woods. They had a big bonfire in a small bowl-shaped valley surrounded on all sides by forest. They were listening to music and letting off firecrackers and making all kinds of noise when a bipedal creature covered in hair crept down the hillside and into the light of the fire. She said it was covered in long brownish hair and looked like an old man with a long beard, but without a mustache. It was 6 feet tall and walked with its arms up like a T-Rex. It was acting curious, like a child. I was glued to every word of this woman's story, and I was taking in every detail. She said the other kids were getting scared, so they started throwing firecrackers at it. Can you believe that? I would have given anything to have been there that night. I've had numerous unexplained experiences, and I found tracks at the creek not too far from my home. Actually, tracks are everywhere around here. I hope you don't mind my cruddy typing abilities and can tell my story. I hope everyone who has a story will come to your page and tell it. Thank you so much, Cam. I hope you're having an awesome new year. An avid listener and subscriber. Thanks, Brandon. Oh, man, your cruddy typing abilities and storytelling abilities will never approach how cruddy mine are, brother. So don't you feel bad one bit. But this is a cool story. I mean, you know, it's not a big in-your-face kind of violent encounter, but how would you like to walk out of your house and look next to the barn and see some eyes standing 8 feet off the ground, spread real far apart? Red glowing eyes. Holy crap. I just don't, I live out in the country, and if I saw that, I would be a little shook up. I walked outside, I guess it was day before yesterday. It was early. It was about 4:30 in the morning. It was still dark. I was outside. I woke up early. I was drinking some coffee, and I always put a headlight on, and I was having a smoke. I smoke 2 or 3 cigarettes every morning. That's all I smoke. I just love cigarettes with my coffee. And I hit that light once I walked out in the backyard. And man, as soon as I hit that light, there were 4 sets of eyes about, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 yards into the woods. And they just sat there. Now, I knew they were deer. But they weren't moving. Normally a deer's going to bob his head up and down, up and down, up and down, or he's going to turn his head and the eyes are not going to shine for a minute. Then they're going to come back, and you know what he's doing. He's turning his head. But a deer kind of makes things out. If it's still, they bob their head up and down. You know, I do that when I look at things in the woods. I'll move my head a little bit. So I knew it was a deer, but it kind of made me nervous. But I didn't run inside. I just stood there and I looked at him. And then I heard him walking off, and I knew it was a deer. But to see, how would you like to see 4 sets of red eyes? Oh, man, I think I would just lose it. Anyway, I'm just rambling on. I'm having a good time with these stories. Brandon has a great story, buddy. Thank you very much. This story is really good. It's very well written by a man who I believe reads a lot. You can tell when somebody reads a lot because they write pretty well. And he actually sent this in the mail, and it took me probably a month to get to the post office, and it was sitting there. And it's been laying on my desk for a few weeks, and I'm really ready to share this story with you. It's really good, so I hope you enjoy it. The man's name is Jason. Here's what he writes. Please accept the following account. It is true and has turned me from a disinterested skeptic into a thoroughly attentive fence sitter. All right, here we go. That's what he writes. All right, here we go. Let me preface my story by saying that although I grew up in a suburb of Raleigh, North Carolina, I've always been a country boy at heart. My paternal grandparents had a farm in central North Carolina, and when I wasn't there, I wanted to be. There were rolling hills, creeks, and milo fields, separated by tracts of hardwoods teeming with squirrels, rabbits, and quail. Some of the happiest times of my life were spent on this farm, roaming the woods, camping, hunting, and fishing. For a young boy who craved adventure, it was paradise. I would disappear into the woods for days. Back then, it simply wasn't a big deal for a young boy to go off camping by himself as long as his parents had a general idea as to where he would be and when he would get back. Looking back, I was probably safer in the woods on my grandfather's farm than just about anywhere else. There are no dangerous animals in this part of the state, and the only things that caused me concern were ticks, chiggers, and the occasional copperhead. When I wasn't playing Daniel Boone on the farm, I would often go on trips with my Boy Scout troop in the nearby Uwharrie. He spelled it out phonetically for me. Uwharrie, and see, I pronounced it wrong. in the nearby Uwharrie National Forest. If you aren't familiar with it, this national forest is about 51,000 acres, with most of it in Montgomery County. I've hiked a considerable amount of this forest, sometimes willingly and sometimes begrudgingly due to a directionally challenged assistant scoutmaster who we nicknamed Lost Again Lewis. Oh, that's so funny. His shortcuts could turn a 5-mile day hike into a 20-mile overnight hike. I mention all this simply to establish that from an early age I would regularly spend time in the woods. I'm familiar with the local animals and I don't spook easily. Unfortunately, when relating a story such as this, you feel obligated to qualify yourself in order to preemptively silence some of the questions from armchair cynics. I've never really understood why, but to me, a lot of the Uwharrie National Forest has a foreboding feel. There are places that even on a sunny day in winter, when all the leaves have fallen, seem unnaturally dark and sinister. Several books written by local folklorist Fred Morgan support this observation and contain many accounts of disconcerting and often violent events that have occurred in the area. In early March of 2012, I had a little time off, and I decided to load up my old Land Rover and head out for a remote camping spot in the northwest Uwharries. I've always preferred to hike, hunt, and fish and camp alone. To me, the solitude is cathartic. To my delight, the campground I chose was completely deserted. There was a host site that contained an older travel trailer, but its condition indicated that it was abandoned. I selected a site at the very end of a loop road, as far from the unoccupied trailer and as close to the dense woods as I could get. I planned on being there at least 4 or 5 days, so I set up my large 6-person Cabela's dome tent rather than my smaller backpacking tent. After eating supper, I decided to turn in early. It was already getting dark and I was bushed. I settled into my sleeping bag and turned off my lantern and was very quickly fast asleep. Around midnight, I was awoken by a distant howl that my sleep-addled mind tells me is probably a wolf, even though I know there are no wolves in central North Carolina. In response to the cry, a pack of dogs began to bay. I lay still for a few minutes listening to all the racket, but soon it died down and all was quiet. Having heard many odd noises while in the woods and being a pragmatic, I chuckled to myself and tried to go back to sleep. My sixth sense was tapping me on the shoulder and saying that something wasn't exactly right, but I closed my eyes anyway. 10 to 15 minutes later, as I began to drift back to sleep, the howls repeated, and this time it was closer. Again, it was a similar cry of a wolf, but the tone wasn't quite right. It was lower and deeper. The dogs again reacted with a chorus of yowling, but they seemed rather far away. They were reacting to an unknown caller, but they were not following it, or it had eluded them. At this point, I was a bit puzzled, but certainly not scared. It bothered me that I couldn't identify the animal that was making the yells, but I knew for an absolute fact that there were no dangerous animals in this part of the state. Also, I had a pistol on me, and what were the odds that this animal, whatever it was, would come directly to me into my camp? There was no chance at all, right? Again, I shrugged and closed my eyes. This time, I fell into a deep, comfortable sleep. 45 minutes later, I'm jolted awake by a rumbling bellow that seemed right on top of me, and it was just as loud, very loud. My first thought, as I shook the sleep from my head, was that someone outside my tent was roaring at me through a bullhorn. It was so close, so unidentifiable, and so loud that I was immediately terrified. Even more disturbingly, as the scream slowly died out, it was replaced by heavy breathing and bipedal footsteps in the leaf litter heading towards my tent. I tried to convince myself that this must be a person playing a dangerous practical joke, but the steps were much too heavy. I remember having the bizarre thought that this prankster must be stomping around with anvils tied to their shoes. And that absurd idea made me quickly realize that this was no prank. There was an exceptionally large and angry animal outside my tent, and I had no idea what it was. Sitting up, but still halfway in my sleeping bag, I slowly and quietly scooched to the middle of the large tent, ridiculously believing that somehow being in the center would provide some safety. I quietly grabbed my compact 9mm out of my duffel bag, and I slowly flipped the safety and I listened. When you're truly frightened, you feel flushed, your senses seem to sharpen, and time appears to slow down. I could hear every leaf and twig that broke under this creature's feet as it approached. I also vividly recall turning my head towards the oncoming noise, and with each footfall seeing small ripples being created and a half-empty bottle of water across the dark tent, exactly like in the first Jurassic Park movie. Options ran through my mind. I could yell out and hope that whatever this was would be startled and leave. I could step out of the tent and confront it, or I could remain quiet and see what happened. I had no idea what was outside, so I decided to sit still and wait. The footsteps were getting closer, but they slowed in pace. They stopped at what I guessed would be about 10 feet away from my tent. I had my pistol pointed in this thing's direction, and I was debating whether to fire off a couple of blind rounds through the tent wall. I'm very conscious about gun safety and would normally never consider this, but abject terror can result in bad decisions. In retrospect, I genuinely believe that had this creature taken another couple of steps towards me, I would have emptied the clip. Well, thankfully, I didn't. The animal was now standing still, and it began making an odd snuffling sound that led me to believe it was smelling the air. It reminded me of a pig grunting, only deeper, and it was always followed by a long and heavy exhale. The animal was a few feet outside, sniffing and grunting and snorting, trying to determine its next step, and I was sitting in the middle of the tent, sweating and horrified with a death grip on my little pistol. This went on for what seemed like several minutes, though more likely it was only 30 to 40 seconds. I was so tense that my arm holding the pistol began to shake, and I felt like I was going to hyperventilate. I felt that I was close to a physical and mental breaking point, and I knew that I desperately needed for this to end. After a few more frantic seconds of thought, I realized that, for good or bad, I must try to take control of the situation. I resolved to quietly slip out of my sleeping bag, slit open the back tent, and jump out ready to shoot. I made a bit of noise while trying to slide my legs out of the sleeping bag, and the animal let out a grunt that almost sounded like a question. There was an upward inflection at the end of the noise that made me think it might have been confused. Looking back, I believe it may not have been certain that I was in the tent until I heard the movement. I froze, and for a few more seconds there was an absolute and terrifying silence. Then there was a deep and what I imagined to be a derisive grunt. It sounded like a bull snorting, but seemed to have an almost cynical tone. It then began to stomp off in the direction from which it came, grunting loudly with every step. As this thing trudged off, I heard a loud cracking sound as if a large tree branch was being broken, and then another deafening roar, the sound of something being dragged in the leaves, and heavy footsteps continued to move away. I stayed perfectly quiet until I couldn't hear it any longer, and then I took a deep breath to relieve some of the stress in my body. I was still on alert, but slowly beginning to relax a little. After a few more minutes of silence, I decided that the animal was probably gone, but there was no way that I was going to spend the rest of the night in that flimsy nylon tent. I grabbed my car keys and stealthily unzipped the tent and crept to my vehicle. My pistol was still in my hand. I would drive to the closest town, find a well-lit parking lot, and sleep in my car. Tomorrow, I would go back to collect my gear. So I fired up my Rover and turned on the headlights, and to my horror, there was a large tree limb about 10 feet in front of the truck, blocking my exit. It was big enough that I don't think I could drive over it without doing some significant damage to my vehicle, but it was not so large that I couldn't drag it partially out of the way and drive around it. I decided, however, that I wasn't going to get out of my car until daylight. I turned off the lights, I lowered my seat all the way back, I rolled my window down about a half-inch so I could hear, and I turned off the ignition. The rest of the night is a blur to me now. I didn't go back to sleep, but there were times that I wasn't completely awake either. I would start to nod off, but my mind would not allow it. Thankfully, nothing else happened, and at first light, I was able to break camp and move the tree branch enough to get my vehicle out. When I returned home, my wife immediately asked, "Why are you back so soon?" I didn't want to lie, but I simply couldn't figure out a way to explain what had happened without sounding like a lunatic. So I just made up a story about not realizing that there was no cell service, and I didn't feel comfortable being out of touch with her for 4 or 5 days. Again, before this incident, I had no real interest in cryptids. However, I immediately began reading everything I could on them, focusing on reports from the Uwharrie region. To my great surprise, I found several accounts from this area, including a rather famous one. I learned that I was remarkably close to the sighting made by Michael Green, I think that's his name, who at the time was involved with the BFRO in North Carolina, and who had recorded thermal video of a humanoid figure snatching a candy bar from the top of a tree stump. At a family gathering not long afterwards, my maternal grandmother, who grew up just outside the northwest boundary of the forest, became upset when she was told I had been camping there alone. She said that I shouldn't go there by myself and it was too dangerous. Well, when I asked her why, she wouldn't give me a straight answer. She would simply repeat, "Just don't go there alone. You should not go there alone." I'm still not convinced that I had an encounter with the hairy linebacker, but I don't know what animal walks on 2 feet and causes the ground to vibrate, roars louder than a lion, and breaks tree limbs. If you can come up with one, please let me know. However, I didn't actually see anything, and the more practical side of me believes that there must be a rational explanation. If it was a Bigfoot, then I'm glad I didn't see it. And I'm very happy not having a close-up image of that ugly mug in my head. The event alarmed me enough that I didn't go into the woods for a while, but I couldn't stay away for long. I gave away my tents, I bought some larger guns, and eventually I purchased a small travel trailer. When I'm out overnight now, I sleep like a baby. Maybe it's a false sense of security, but it works for me. I hope I didn't prattle on too much and keep up the good work. Kind regards, Jason. And, that's just as good as a visual sighting. Matter of fact, it's probably scarier. I mean, you can't see what's out there. It's so heavy and its footfalls are so heavy that they shake the ground and you can see water rippling in a water bottle. Man, that would just scare me to death. So I fully understand why he didn't go back in the woods for a while. But I also understand how being in a travel trailer gives you a sense of security. I mean, it's a tent. They can pick you up like a sack and carry you off. They have to break into a travel trailer. And, for a guy who spent all his life in the woods and never experienced anything like this and then goes through this one night as an adult, I mean, it's just got to change your life. Absolutely change your life. But Jason, thank you for a great story. I really enjoyed, I had a good time reading it, just reviewing it. I'm sitting there at the edge of my seat, and I'm so glad you sent it so I could share it on this channel. Jason, I appreciate you, and I hope you're doing well in North Carolina. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for listening to this video to this point. I really appreciate you. And we'll see you guys on the next marathon. Thanks.